Hi Year 5, Happy New Year. I hope you're all doing really well. So this term we are going to be looking at the age of exploration for our humanities work, and every week I will be giving you a little video talking about the different aspects of exploration in the Americas, so explorers who went to find America, and then there will be a little task for you to do which I will set for you on Google Classroom. So for today's lesson, you will need a pen or a pencil, a notebook, and the Google quiz, which can be found on your Google Classroom, and that is titled Humanities Lesson 1. So pause the video here while you go and get your things that you need. So for today's lesson, our learning intention is to understand how the search for the Spice Islands changed history. So you're going to be learning about what the Spice Islands were and how they were and why they were so important. In your success criteria, or for your success criteria, you are going to make notes on the key information. You are going to understand the importance of the Spice Islands, and you are going to understand how explorers changed the trade relationships between countries. So there's some words in there which might be a little bit tricky, but as we go through, I will make sure that I explain what they mean and you can note that down. If you would like to, you can pause the video here and write down the learning intention in your notebooks. So the first thing I would like you to do is think about what spices are. Do you use them in your houses? Maybe you do when you're in the kitchen and you're cooking. Maybe your parents use them. Maybe your grandparents use them. So think about the types of cooking you do and whether you use spices or not. There are some pictures here to kind of give you some clues. And think about some examples as well. So if you would like, you can write some examples down in your notebook, and we're going to talk about them on the next slide. So the dictionary definition for spices are an aromatic or pungent, which means quite strong, vegetable substance used to flavour food. Okay, so that's what we know spices are. They're used to make our food more exciting, add a bit of spice and a bit of heat to it, and to make it a lot more delicious to eat. Some examples of spices you might use are turmeric, which is the yellow powder that you can see on our picture. You've got paprika, cloves and cumin, and obviously there are lots of other spices that you can use in your everyday cooking. Now, did you know that it was the medieval European love for spices that made the United States of America the country it is today? So actually, there is a really strong relationship between the medieval Europeans, their love for spice, and how they explored and found America, okay, and how they made it into the country that it is today. Surprisingly, it is the love and the search for the spices that inspired so many explorers, and we're going to find out a bit more information now. Remember, you should be making notes as you're going along now, and I will be giving you some ideas about what things you need to be noting down and the key information that you need. So nowadays we use spices to add flavour to our food, but during medieval Europe, people relied on spices not only to flavour their food, but also as a way to preserve it, so to keep it fresh, to keep it not rotting basically, so that it's safe to eat. So if you want to, you can write a little note about that. Now remember, they didn't have electricity in medieval times, so they didn't have fridges or any way to keep their food cold, which meant they had to use spices to extend the time period of how long they could use their meat for. Okay, so spices were really important, not only for flavouring, but for also preservation of food. However, these spices were expensive because it took a lot of time and a lot of effort to sail across the seas in order to get their spices from Asia. And this meant that a lot of medieval Europeans, if you weren't very rich, then it would be very difficult for you to get the spices because you couldn't afford it. And this predicament led to the age of exploration and settlement on the Americas. Okay, so it was actually this problem of people not being able to get their spices that they love so much for a reasonable price that they decided to take things into their own hands and decide to explore to find these treasured land where spices were so available, readily available. I'm going to pause. You can pause the video here and make some notes about that. It's really, really important you understand why spices led to the exploration. Okay, remember, it was the love for these spices that meant that people wanted to explore and find a cheaper way to get them. So let's find out a little bit more about the Spice Islands now. So the spices came from a range of different places, but the most common were spices from Indonesia. You can see on the map that the Indonesia islands are circled in red. You can see where they are in relation to China and Australia. Indonesia is a chain of islands known as the Malay Archipelago. Within this group is the Maluku Islands, and they were probably the most famous islands and were nicknamed by the Europeans as the Spice Islands. It was the exceptional soil quality and the weather that made the island so perfect for growing spices. So the mixture of the heat and the moisture and the fact that the soil was so fertile and rich in vitamins and minerals and nutrients for these plants, that spices were able to grow in amazing quantities and of very good quality. Now, the Europeans had no knowledge of where these islands were located. Remember, they didn't have the internet, or they weren't able to just find it on using a GPS signal. They had to look at maps, and a lot of these explorers had not travelled to these amazing islands. So it was only a very small amount of people that actually knew where these spices could be found. And that meant that the Europeans had to rely on traders who would come from those areas and bring the spices to Europe. I want you to pause here and I want you to make some notes about the names of the islands, why they were called the Spice Islands, and why they were so good in growing spices. So what three things made them really made the spices of very good quality. And I also want you to write down why the Europeans were probably getting a little bit annoyed by this point, because remember, they had to rely on other people to bring them their spices, and they were obviously of a very expensive amount of money as well. So during the Middle Ages, the spice trade was actually controlled by Arab traders. Now, they controlled the market not only for the Spice Islands, but also because they were able to get ginger from China and cinnamon from India. And for hundreds of years, from around 1100 to 1400, the Arabs managed to keep the location of the Spice Islands a secret. And how they did this was by making up stories about how dangerous it was to travel to the islands. So some of these stories involved monsters and hideous flesh-eating birds. And people believed these stories and thought to themselves, well, we don't want to go and explore because we might get killed. It's probably very dangerous. So in that way, it meant that the Arab traders had a monopoly of the spice trade. And by monopoly, that means they had the control. They were able to go and get the spices and sell them for a high price for people that wanted these spices, because they didn't want to risk themselves by going to the Spice Islands. Now, obviously, now we know that those stories were made up. They obviously weren't very true. But in those days, people didn't really know much different, but they believed the Arab traders and thought it was very dangerous for them to go and explore. So pause the video here and make some key notes about some of that information, particularly about the fact that the Arabs used to tell stories in order to stop people from going to the Spice Islands themselves. So along their travels, the Arab traders would trade with Venetian traders from Venice in Italy. Now, this meant that anyone wanting to buy spices in Europe would then have to deal with the Venetians, and this made them very rich. So, if you imagine, the Arab traders have gone to the Spice Islands, they've collected all the spices that they know that people would like, and on their way, they've stopped by Italy, and they've actually traded with the people of Venice, who are known as the Venetians, and the Venetians were then in control of Europe, and people who were in countries of Europe like England and France and Germany who wanted spices were able to trade with the Venetians. But then obviously that made them very rich because they charged a higher price as well. Now, the Venetian traders were getting quite greedy and they decided that they didn't want to deal with the Arabs anymore. Why should they pay money to them when they could actually go and try and find it themselves? Okay, so this inspired many explorers, and one such explorer was a man called Marco Polo, and he was from Venice. So we're going to find out a little bit of information about Marco Polo now. And if you pause here, it will be good for you to write down how the Venetians were in control of the spice trade of Europe. So Marco Polo was born in Venice in Italy in 1254 and was destined to be an explorer. That meant that it was in his genes because his father was a famous merchant and he spent his time searching for spices and was quite a famous explorer himself. He started his first trip to Asia in 1271 at the age of 17 years old, and Marco Polo travelled to the Mongol Empire, which was in China, with his father and uncle. So his first expedition was with his father and his uncle, and their journey took them 4 years. It took them that long in order to travel along the sea, along the oceans, to get to China. And he stayed in China for 17 years with his father and uncle, and he worked for the Mughal emperor. And he would go and work, focus on businesses and bring in more trade for the Chinese. And the emperor opened up the trade routes for the merchants. So he was able to say to the emperor, we have European people, that explorers that want to come and trade with you, please open the routes for us. So in that way, he was able to allow more explorers to travel to Asia. So in 1295, Marco Polo returned to Venice. Soon after, he was captured during a war with a neighbouring city. Polo was sent to jail. His cellmate was the writer from the city of Pisa. During his days in prison, Polo talked about his travels, and the writer wrote down what Marco said. Together, the two cellmates produced a book that helped change the world. Marco Polo would tell stories to his cellmate, and his cellmate would then write them into a book. And the Travels of Marco Polo was the book that they created, and it was read by people all over Europe, first in handwritten copies and then later in printed editions. Polo was the first European to write about China, Thailand, and the Malay archipelago and other Asian lands. His book inspired European mapmakers to update their maps. Almost 200 years after it was written, this book inspired an Italian sea captain named Christopher Columbus. And we are going to find out a lot more about Christopher Columbus in our next lesson. So it's really important that you make some notes here about the life of Marco Polo and how he helped to create exploration to China and make it easier for people to explore Asia as well, and how he inspired Christopher Columbus. The Travels of Marco Polo is actually a really famous book, and you can see extracts of that book online as well. So if you're interested, you can have a read. So pause the video here while you make some more notes. Okay, so now you've watched the video and made notes on the key information that I've talked about, you need to complete your task. I want you to go into your Google Classroom and open the Google quiz, which is titled Humanities Lesson 1. And you can use your notes to answer the questions, and I'll be checking to see how you get on. So good luck, and I look forward to looking through all of your work. Enjoy!